A 7-year-old girl was cast out into the scorching Arizona desert, left to die because the wagon train believed her fever carried the devil's own curse, until an Apache warrior named Gray Fox discovered her nearly lifeless body beneath this unforgiving sun and made a choice that would change 3 lives forever.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The year was 1847, and the Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly in all directions like a sea of sand and stone, beneath a sky that burned white-hot with merciless intensity. The wagon train had been crawling across this wasteland for 6 days now, leaving behind the relative comfort of Tucson and heading toward the promised land of California. But comfort was a luxury none of them could afford anymore, not with water running low and tempers running high, and certainly not with the child's fever getting worse by the hour. Little Clara Belle lay delirious in the back of the Donovan wagon, her small body racked with chills despite the brutal heat that made the canvas cover feel like the inside of an oven. Her auburn hair was plastered to her head with sweat, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. She had been burning with fever for 3 days now, muttering in languages no one recognized, her green eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. The other travelers whispered that it wasn't natural, this sickness that made a child speak in tongues and burn like a coal while her skin remained pale as winter snow. Martha Donovan knelt beside the girl, pressing a damp cloth to her forehead, with hands that trembled from exhaustion and fear. She had volunteered to care for Clara Belle when the child's own parents had died of cholera 2 weeks back, but now she was beginning to wonder if her Christian charity had doomed them all. The fever that consumed Clara Belle was unlike anything Martha had seen in her 43 years of frontier living. It came and went in waves, spiking so high that the child's skin felt like touching a hot stove, then dropping so low that her lips turned blue and her breathing became shallow as a dying bird's. "She's getting worse," Martha whispered to her husband Patrick, who was driving their wagon with the grim determination of a man who had already buried 3 children of his own. "The fever's not breaking. If anything, it's getting stronger." Patrick Donovan was a hard man made harder by the unforgiving demands of frontier life. He had calloused hands from 20 years of working the land, weather-beaten skin from countless days under the prairie sun, and eyes that had seen too much death to be surprised by it anymore. But even he was troubled by the child's condition. It wasn't just the fever that worried him, it was the way she spoke during her delirium, babbling in what sounded like Apache words mixed with Spanish and something else entirely, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "We're losing precious water on her," Patrick said quietly, his voice barely audible over the creaking of wagon wheels and the constant wind that swept across the desert floor. "And the others are starting to talk. They think she's cursed, Martha. They think she's bringing bad luck to the whole train." Martha's jaw tightened with stubborn resolve. "She's just a child, Patrick. A sick child who's lost everything. We can't abandon her." But even as she spoke the words, Martha could feel the weight of suspicious stares from the other travelers. There were 12 families in their wagon train, 43 souls in total, and every one of them was struggling to survive in this harsh landscape. Water was rationed to a cup per person per day. Food was running dangerously low, and the desert seemed to stretch on forever without end. In such desperate circumstances, compassion became a luxury that many could no longer afford. The whispers had started on the 2nd day of Clara Belle's fever, when old Mrs. Henderson claimed she'd heard the child speaking to someone who wasn't there, carrying on full conversations in Apache tongue, despite having been raised by Irish Catholic parents who spoke nothing but English. By the 3rd day, when the child's fever spiked so high that she began convulsing and calling out names in languages that chilled the blood, the whispers had turned to open accusations of witchcraft and demonic possession. "It ain't natural," declared Ezra Caldwell, the self-appointed leader of their wagon train. A man whose stern Methodist beliefs left no room for phenomena he couldn't understand or control. No white child should be speaking Apache, especially not one who's never been around them people. And the way her eyes roll back. That's the devil's work, mark my words. Caldwell was a tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair and a beard that reached nearly to his chest. He carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and his word carried significant weight among the other families. When he spoke of curses and demonic influence, people listened. When he suggested that Clarabelle's continued presence might doom them all, they began to nod in agreement. "We've had nothing but trouble since we took that child in," added Jonas. Fletcher, a farmer from Missouri whose own daughter had fallen ill with dysentery just 2 days after Clarabelle's fever began. "First my Lucy gets sick, then the Henderson boy breaks his arm falling from a wagon. Then we lose a wheel to them rocks yesterday. That ain't coincidence. That's a curse following that child wherever she goes." The accusations grew more heated. As the day wore on and the desert sun beat down on them with relentless fury. By evening, when they made camp in the shadow of a red rock formation that offered little relief from the heat, a group of men had gathered around Caldwell's fire to discuss what they called the Clarabelle problem. Their voices carried clearly in the still desert air, and Martha could hear every word from where she sat beside their own wagon, cooling the child's burning forehead with their precious water. "She's got to go," Caldwell stated flatly, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "We can't risk the whole train for one sick child, especially not one that's clearly touched by evil." "You're talking about murder," Martha called out, her voice shaking with anger and desperation. "That child has done nothing wrong except fall ill. Where's your Christian charity, Ezra Caldwell?" Caldwell's eyes were cold as winter stones when he looked at her. "Christian charity don't extend to harboring demons, Mrs. Donovan. That child ain't natural, and keeping her with us is putting every soul in this train at risk. We've got our own families to think about." "She's right," added Henry Morrison, a blacksmith whose massive arms were crossed over his chest like iron bands. "We leave her at first light. Give her some water, say a prayer, and let the Lord sort out the rest. You can't." Martha stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "I won't let you abandon a child to die in this desert. If you try to take her, you'll have to go through me first." The men exchanged glances, and Martha could see her husband Patrick struggling with the impossible choice between his wife's conscience and the survival of their group. The desert was unforgiving, and going against the majority could mean death. For all of them, if the other families decided to continue on without the DONOVANS. As if summoned by the heated argument, Clarabelle began to stir in the back of the wagon. Her fever had spiked again, and she was muttering in that strange mixture of languages that made everyone's skin crawl. But this time, her words were clearer, more distinct, and what she said made every person in the camp go silent with fear. "They're coming," Clarabelle whispered, her voice carrying across the desert air with unnatural clarity. "The Apache, they're watching us. They know we're here." A chill ran through the camp that had nothing to do with the desert night. Every eye turned toward the darkness beyond their firelight, searching for signs of movement among the rocks and cacti. In this part of Arizona territory, Apache raids were a constant threat, and many wagon trains had simply vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind but scattered bones and burned wood. "How does she know that?" Fletcher whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle propped against his wagon wheel. "How could she possibly know?" Caldwell's face had gone pale, but his resolve remained firm. "All the more reason to get rid of her. She's calling to them somehow, drawing them to us. That child is going to get us all killed." The argument that followed was fierce but brief. Fear, it turned out, was a more powerful motivator than compassion, and one by one, the families voted to abandon Clarabelle when they broke camp at dawn. Only the Donovans stood against the decision, but they were outnumbered 11-1.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Martha wept as she held the delirious child through the night, knowing that come morning, she would be forced to choose between her own family's survival and her conscience. Dawn came too soon, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red that looked like blood spilled across the horizon. The camp stirred to life with the efficient movements of people who had learned to break camp quickly and move on before the heat became unbearable. But this morning was different. This morning, they would leave behind more than just the ashes of their campfire. Clarabelle was barely conscious when they lifted her from the wagon, her small body limp as a rag doll. The fever had taken a terrible toll, leaving her skin pale and waxy, her breathing shallow and irregular. Martha had used the last of their precious water trying to keep her temperature down, but it had done little good. The child was dying, and everyone knew it. "At least make it quick," Martha pleaded as Caldwell and 2 other men carried Clarabelle away from the wagon train. "Don't let her suffer." Caldwell's jaw was set like granite. "We ain't murderers, Mrs. Donovan. We're leaving her with water and a blanket. If the Lord wills it, maybe someone will find her. Maybe the fever will break. But we can't risk our own families any longer." They carried Clarabelle perhaps 100 yards from the trail to a small cluster of rocks that offered some shade from the morning sun. There they left her with a single water skin and a thin blanket, along with a small wooden cross that Mrs. Henderson had carved from a piece of oak. It was more mercy than many would have shown, but it felt like murder all the same. As the wagon train rolled away, leaving a trail of dust and broken dreams in its wake, Martha looked back one last time at the small figure lying among the rocks. Clarabelle was too weak to call out, too far gone to even lift her head, but her green eyes followed the departing wagons with an expression that would haunt Martha's dreams for the rest of her life. The desert swallowed the wagon train sounds within minutes, leaving behind only the vast silence of the wilderness and the dying child who had been cast out like refuse. Clarabelle lay motionless in the shade of the rocks, her fever-bright eyes staring up at a sky that burned white as bone. She could feel her life ebbing away like water poured into sand, but she was too weak to be afraid, too far gone to understand that she was dying alone in one of the most unforgiving places on earth. But she was not as alone as she thought. From a ridge overlooking the desert floor, a figure watched the wagon train disappear into the distance. Gray Fox had been tracking the white settlers for 2 days, observing their movements and assessing the threat they posed to his people. He had seen many such groups pass through Apache territory, most of them moving quickly and quietly, hoping to avoid contact with the tribes who called this harsh land home. This group had been different, though. There had been arguing, dissension, and the sound of a child crying in the night. Gray Fox's keen eyes had watched as they carried the small figure away from their camp, and his warrior's instincts told him that something significant had just occurred. The white settlers had abandoned one of their own, leaving her to die in the desert like a wounded animal. Gray Fox was a man of 30 summers, lean and hard as the desert itself, with skin bronzed by years under the Arizona sun and eyes as dark as obsidian. He wore his black hair long and unbraided, decorated with a single eagle feather that marked his status as a warrior of proven courage. His clothing was practical rather than ceremonial buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt traded from Mexican merchants, and moccasins that made no sound as he moved across the rocky ground. He had earned his name in childhood for his ability to move unseen and unheard through any terrain, slipping through enemy territory like a shadow cast by moonlight. It was a skill that had served him well as a scout and raider, allowing him to gather intelligence and strike at enemies before they knew he was there. But it was also a skill that had isolated him from his own people, marking him as different, solitary, a man who walked between worlds without fully belonging to either. Gray Fox descended from the ridge with the fluid grace of a natural predator, his moccasined feet finding purchase on loose rock and shifting sand without disturbing so much as a pebble. He moved in a wide circle around the abandoned child, using all his senses to confirm that the whites had truly departed and that no trap was being laid. Only when he was certain that Clarabelle was alone did he approach the cluster of rocks. Where she lay dying, what he found there stopped him in his tracks. The child was white, clearly, with the pale skin and auburn hair of the Irish settlers who had been flooding into Apache territory for the past decade. But there was something about her that made Gray Fox's breath catch in his throat. As she lay unconscious in the shade of the rocks, her fever-flushed face turned toward the sky, she was murmuring softly in perfect Apache, speaking words that no white child should have known. "Grandmother," she whispered in his native tongue, her voice barely audible. "Grandmother, I'm so cold. Why did they leave me? Why am I alone?" Gray Fox knelt beside her, his dark eyes studying her face with growing amazement. This was impossible. White children did not speak Apache unless they had been raised among the people, and this girl clearly had not. Her clothes, her appearance, everything about her screamed of white settler origins. Yet she was calling out in his language, using inflections and pronunciations that spoke of deep familiarity with Apache ways. More troubling still was what she called him when her fever-bright eyes finally focused on his face. As Gray Fox reached out to touch her burning forehead, Clarabelle looked up at him and spoke a single word that sent ice through his veins despite the desert heat. "Father," she whispered in Apache, her small hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "Father, you came back." Gray Fox jerked back as if he had been struck by lightning. This child, this white child abandoned by her own people, was calling him father, in the sacred language of his ancestors. It was impossible, unthinkable, and yet something deep in his chest responded to her words with a recognition that defied all logic and reason. He stared down at Clarabelle's face, memorizing every detail, searching for some explanation for the impossible familiarity he felt when he looked at her. Her fever-flushed features, her auburn hair, her green eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom no child should possess. There was nothing about her that should have seemed familiar, and yet everything about her called to something buried deep. In his memory as Gray Fox wrestled with the implications of what he had witnessed, Clarabelle's breathing grew more labored, and her skin took on the waxy pallor that preceded death. Whatever strange connection existed between them, whatever impossible recognition had passed between a white child and an Apache warrior, it would mean nothing if she died here in the desert sun. Gray Fox made his decision with the swift certainty that had kept him alive through countless battles and raids. He gathered Clarabelle into his arms, surprised by how light she was, how fragile her small body felt against his chest. She was burning with fever, her breathing shallow and irregular. But she was still alive, still fighting, still calling him father in a language she should never have learned. As he carried her away from the rocks where her own people had left her to die, Gray Fox found himself speaking to her, Apache, his voice soft and reassuring. "Be strong, little one. Gray Fox has found you now. You will not die alone in the desert. This I promise you." Clarabelle stirred in his arms, her fever-bright eyes focusing on his face with an intensity that made his heart race. When she spoke, her words were clear and certain, spoken in Apache as perfect as any child raised among his people. "I knew you would come," she whispered. "I dreamed about you. The grandmother told me you would find me when the sun touched the rocks. She said you would carry me home." Gray Fox's step never faltered as he carried her across the desert toward his hidden camp, but his mind reeled with questions that had no answers. Who was this child? How did she know his language? Why did she call him father with such certainty? And who was this grandmother she spoke of, a figure that seemed to exist only in her fever dreams? As the sun climbed higher in the sky and the Heat of the desert began to build toward its daily crescendo. Gray Fox pressed on, carrying the white child who spoke like Apache, who called him father, who had been cast out by her own people for being touched by something they could not understand. Behind them, the wagon train continued its journey west, unaware that they had just set in motion events that would challenge everything both peoples believed about blood, family, and the mysterious ways that fate could bind together the most. Unlikely of souls. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a harsh and unforgiving landscape that had claimed countless lives over the centuries. But today it would give life instead of taking it, as an Apache warrior named Gray Fox carried a dying white child toward a destiny that neither of them could yet imagine. Gray Fox's hidden camp lay nestled in a canyon carved deep into the red sandstone cliffs, invisible to any traveler unless they knew exactly where to look. Ancient cottonwood trees provided precious shade along a narrow stream that ran year-round, fed by springs hidden in the rock walls above. It was a place his grandfather had shown him as a boy, a secret refuge that had sheltered Apache families for generations when the white soldiers came hunting. The journey from the desert floor had taken 3 hours of careful climbing along narrow ledges and hidden trails that would challenge even an experienced mountain goat. Clarabelle had grown heavier in his arms as her fever intensified, her small body burning like a coal against his chest. Several times she had convulsed so violently that Gray Fox feared she might die before he could reach safety, but each time she had rallied, clinging to life with a tenacity that amazed him. Now, as he descended the final steep path into the canyon, Gray Fox could see smoke rising from the cooking fires below. His grandmother, Bright Moon, stood waiting at the entrance to her healing lodge, her ancient eyes already fixed on the bundle in his arms. At 83 winters, she was the oldest member of their small band, a medicine woman whose knowledge of healing herbs and spiritual practices had saved countless lives over the decades. "You carry trouble in your arms, grandson," Bright Moon said without preamble as Gray Fox approached. Her voice was like wind through dry leaves, weathered but still strong. She wore traditional Apache dress, a long buckskin skirt decorated with silver concos and turquoise beads, and a cotton blouse dyed deep red with desert clay. Her gray hair was braided with strips of otter fur and hung nearly to her waist. "This child was abandoned by her people," Gray Fox replied, carefully lowering Clarabelle to a buffalo hide that Bright Moon had already spread on the ground. "She speaks our language, grandmother. She calls me father, though I have never seen her before in my life." Bright Moon knelt beside Clarabelle, her gnarled hands moving with surprising gentleness as she examined the girl's condition. She pressed her ear to the child's chest, listened to her breathing, and touched her burning forehead with fingertips that had diagnosed illnesses for more than 60 years. "This is no ordinary fever," she murmured, her dark eyes troubled. "The white child burns with more than sickness. She burns with visions, with memories that are not her own." Bright Moon looked up at her grandson sharply. "You said she speaks Apache?" "As well as any child raised among us," Gray Fox confirmed. "She knew my name before I spoke it. She said her grandmother told her I would come." A chill seemed to pass through the old medicine woman, and she rocked back on her heels as if struck by a physical blow. "Show me her hands," she commanded urgently. Gray Fox carefully lifted Clarabelle's small hands, turning her palms upward. There, barely visible beneath the grime and dried sweat, were faint markings that looked almost like birthmark circular patterns on each palm that resembled the sacred symbols used in Apache coming-of-age ceremonies. Bright Moon gasped and began speaking rapidly in Apache, her words tumbling over each other in her excitement. "It cannot be, after all these years. But the signs are there. The fever dreams, the speaking in tongues, the marks of the spirit walker." She looked at Gray Fox with eyes that suddenly seemed far older than her 83 years. "This child is not what she appears to be, grandson. She carries within her the soul of one who walked between worlds. Before Gray Fox could ask what she meant, Clarabelle stirred and opened her eyes. For a moment, her green gaze was unfocused, clouded with fever and confusion. Then she saw Bright Moon kneeling beside her, and her entire expression changed. Wonder and recognition dawned on her face, followed by tears of relief and joy. "Grandmother," Clarabelle whispered in perfect Apache, reaching up with trembling hands toward the old woman's face. "I've been looking for you everywhere. I've been so lost, so frightened. They said I was cursed, but you told me to be strong. You said Gray Fox would find me." Bright Moon's hands shook as she cradled Clarabelle's face, studying every feature, with an intensity that made Gray Fox deeply uncomfortable. The old woman's eyes filled with tears, and when she spoke, her voice cracked with emotion he had never heard before. "Little star," she breathed. "My precious little star, you have come back to us." Gray Fox felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Little Star had been his daughter's name, the daughter who had died in his arms 7 years ago during a cavalry attack on their winter camp. She had been 3 years old, with dark hair and eyes like obsidian, nothing at all like this white child with auburn hair and green eyes. Yet his grandmother, who had loved Little Star like her own blood, was claiming this impossible connection with absolute certainty. "Grandmother, Little Star is dead," Gray Fox said carefully, his voice strained, with the effort of remaining calm. "We buried her beside the river. You sang the death songs yourself." Bright Moon turned to face him, her ancient features transformed by a terrible understanding. "Bodies die, grandson. Souls journey on. Sometimes when the need is great and the love is strong, they find new flesh to inhabit. This child carries Little Star's spirit within her." The words hit Gray Fox like a physical blow. Everything about Clarabelle suddenly took on a different meaning, her immediate recognition of him, her fluent Apache, her calling him father with such certainty. If what his grandmother said was true, if this white child somehow carried his daughter's soul, then everything he thought he knew about death and rebirth was wrong. "That's impossible," he said, but even as he spoke the words, memories began flooding back. Little Star's favorite hiding place had been among the red rocks near their camp. She had always been fascinated by the white butterflies that danced around the desert marigolds, and she had possessed an uncanny ability to know things she couldn't possibly have learned, like the names of stars and the habits of animals she had never seen. Clarabelle struggled to sit up, her fever-bright eyes moving between Gray Fox and Bright Moon with growing urgency. "The soldiers are coming," she said suddenly, her voice taking on a prophetic quality that raised the hair on Gray Fox's arms. "Blue coats with bright buttons. They follow the wagon trail, but they will find this place. The crow told me in my dreams. We have 3 days." Gray Fox and Bright Moon exchanged alarmed glances. The child couldn't possibly know about the cavalry patrol that had been reported moving through the territory, yet her warning carried the ring of truth. In the old days, before the whites came in such numbers, Apache scouts would have brought word of approaching enemies days in advance. But now their traditional scouting networks had been disrupted, and sometimes the first warning of danger came too late. "How could you know this?" Gray Fox asked. Clarabelle's answer sent ice through his veins. "Because Little Star sees with the eyes of the dead as well as the living. The spirits of the ancestors watch over this place, and they whisper warnings to those who remember how to listen." Over the next 2 days, as Bright Moon worked tirelessly to break Clarabelle's fever using every healing technique she had learned over 8 decades of practice, Gray Fox found himself wrestling with questions that challenged everything he believed about the nature of life and death. The child's knowledge of Apache customs was not just fluent, it was intimate, detailed in ways that spoke of lived experience rather than simple observation. She knew the proper prayers to say over healing herbs before they were prepared. She could identify the calls of birds that lived hundreds of miles away in Apache homelands she had never visited. Most disturbing of all, she knew personal details about Gray Fox's life that only his daughter could have known, like the scar on his left shoulder from a hunting accident when he was 12, or the song his mother used to sing to help him sleep during thunderstorms. "Tell me about the butterfly place," Gray Fox said on the second evening, testing her knowledge of something only Little Star had known about. Clarabelle smiled for the first time since he had found her, her green eyes lighting up with genuine joy. "Behind the waterfall where the golden stones sparkle in the sunlight, where the white butterflies dance in circles and the magic flowers grow that taste like honey. You took me there on my 3rd birthday and showed me how to catch water drops in my hands." The description was perfect in every detail, down to the specific type of wildflowers that grew in that hidden grotto. It was a place Gray Fox had discovered as a child and shared with no one except his daughter. No white person had ever been there, and certainly no white child could have known about the butterflies that appeared only during certain seasons. As Clarabelle's fever finally began to break on the 3rd day, her personality started to emerge more clearly. She was curious about everything, asking endless questions about the camp, the people, and the way they lived. But her questions weren't those of an outsider trying to understand a foreign culture. They were the questions of someone returning home after a long absence, trying to reconnect with half-remembered familiar things. "Why do the men paint their faces differently now?" she asked as she watched the warriors preparing for a hunting expedition. "The patterns are wrong. They should be circles for protection, not lines." Bright Moon looked up from the willow bark tea she was preparing, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "Those are the old patterns, child, from before your father was born. How could you know about them?" Clarabelle looked confused for a moment, as if trying to sort through memories that belonged to different times and different lives. I remember them from before, from when the world was different, when there were more of us, and the buffalo covered the plains like storm clouds." That evening, as Gray Fox sat beside the fire watching Clarabelle sleep peacefully for the first time since he had found her, Bright Moon approached with a troubled expression. She carried a leather bundle in her hands, something he recognized as one of her most sacred possessions, a collection of items used for communicating with the spirit world. "There is something you must see," she said quietly, settling beside him on a woven mat. She opened the bundle carefully, revealing several small objects wrapped in white buckskin. From among them, she withdrew a child's necklace made of turquoise and silver beads. Little Star's necklace, the one she had been wearing when she died. "I buried this with her," Gray Fox said, his voice thick with emotion. "You placed it around her neck yourself before we wrapped her in the burial shroud." "Yes," Bright Moon agreed. "And yet 3 days ago, as I was gathering herbs near the burial ground, I found this lying on top of her grave." The beads were warm to the touch, though the morning was cold. There were no footprints in the earth around the grave, no sign that anyone had disturbed the site. Yet somehow the necklace had returned. Gray Fox stared at the familiar piece of jewelry, remembering how Little Star had treasured it, how she had refused to take it off even for sleeping. The beads caught the firelight and seemed to glow with an inner warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. "You think the child is meant to have it," he said. "I think the child already owns it," Bright Moon replied. "I think Little Star's spirit brought it back because she knew she would need it again, in this new form, in this new life." She pressed the necklace into Gray Fox's hands. "When she wakes, you should give this to her. But be prepared for her reaction. If I am right about what she carries within her, touching this necklace will unlock memories that have been sleeping." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the promise of another scorching day ahead. Clarabelle woke feeling stronger than she had since before the fever started, though she still tired easily and her appetite remained poor. Gray Fox found her sitting by the stream, watching the water flow over the smooth stones with the contemplative expression of someone much older than her apparent 7 years. "Are you feeling better, little one?" he asked, settling beside her. On the bank, she nodded, but her green eyes remained troubled. "I keep having dreams about things that haven't happened yet, and memories of things that feel real but can't be. Is that normal when you've been sick with fever?" Gray Fox pulled the turquoise necklace from the pouch at his side, holding it in his palm where she could see it. "Do you recognize this?" Clarabelle's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She gasped and reached for the necklace with trembling hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. The moment her fingers touched the turquoise beads, her entire body went rigid and her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. When she spoke, it was in a voice that Gray Fox recognized with terrifying clarity, the voice of his dead daughter, speaking through this white child's lips with perfect inflection and tone. "Father," Little Star's voice said through Clarabelle's mouth, "I told you I would come back. I told you death was just a journey to another place, not an ending. You didn't believe me then, but now you must. I have returned to you as I promised, though in a form you do not expect." Gray Fox felt his world shatter and remake itself in the space of a heartbeat. Everything he had hoped and feared was true. His daughter lived again, but trapped in the body of a white child who had been cast out by her own people. The impossible had become reality, and he didn't know whether to rejoice or mourn. "Why?" he whispered. "Why this way? Why in this form?" Clarabelle's body remained rigid, but Little Star's voice continued to speak through her. "Because the time of great change is coming, Father. A time when Apache and White must learn to understand each other, or both will perish. I am the bridge between worlds, the proof that souls know no color, no tribe, no boundaries, except those we create with fear and hatred." As suddenly as it had begun, the episode ended. Clarabelle collapsed against Gray Fox's chest, exhausted but herself again. She looked up at him with her own green eyes, though now they seemed to hold depths of wisdom and pain that no 7-year-old should possess. "I remember now," she said simply. "Not everything, but enough. I remember being Little Star, and I remember being Clarabelle. Both are real. Both are me. And now I understand why the grandmother in my dreams kept telling me to be strong, to wait for you to find me. Because this is where I belong, with you, learning to be both Apache and White until the time comes when such distinctions no longer matter." Gray Fox held her close, feeling the weight of destiny settling around them like a cloak. Whether through some miracle of rebirth or the mysterious ways of the spirit world, his daughter had returned to him. But she had returned with a mission that would challenge everything both peoples believed about each other, and the path ahead would be fraught with dangers that neither Apache nor white settler could yet imagine. In the distance, a crow called 3 times, the traditional Apache warning that strangers approached. Clarabelle lifted her head from Gray Fox's chest and listened to the bird's cry with the practiced attention of someone raised in the wilderness. "The soldiers," she said quietly. "They're coming sooner than I thought. We need to leave this place today." Gray Fox nodded grimly. The peaceful interlude was over. Now began the real test of whether love could truly transcend the boundaries of race and blood, and whether a white child carrying an Apache soul could survive in a world that had no place for such impossible things. The evacuation of the hidden canyon happened with the swift efficiency of a people who had learned to disappear at a moment's notice. Within 2 hours of Clarabelle's warning, every trace of Apache presence had been erased from the sanctuary that had sheltered them for months. Cooking fires were scattered in cold, sleeping areas swept clean, and even the paths they had worn in the earth were carefully disguised with brush and stones. Gray Fox led the small band of 12 Apache 3 warriors, 2 elderly men, 4 women, and 3 children through a maze of slot canyons and hidden passages that would confuse even the most experienced tracker. But this time he carried more than just the responsibility for his people's safety. Clarabelle rode on his shoulders, her small hands gripping his long black hair as she scanned the landscape ahead with eyes that seemed to see far more than a 7-year-old should. "There," she said suddenly, pointing toward a distant ridge where nothing was visible to Gray Fox's trained eyes. 6 soldiers on horseback. They found the canyon entrance, but they don't know about the back way out. We have maybe 3 hours before they work their way around to the eastern passage. Swift Deer, Gray Fox's closest friend and fellow warrior, urged his horse closer. "How can the child know this? I see nothing but rocks and sky." Gray Fox had been wrestling with the same question since Clarabelle's first prophetic warning. Whether it was some remnant of Apache spiritual power awakened by her fever, or the mysterious connection to his dead daughter's memories, the child's ability to sense distant events was becoming impossible to ignore. "She sees what we cannot," he answered simply. "We must trust her warnings as we would trust our own scouts." The truth was more complicated than Gray Fox was willing to admit to anyone, even his closest friend. Since the episode with the turquoise necklace, Clarabelle had begun experiencing what she called spirit sight, moments when her consciousness seemed to separate from her body and soar above the landscape like an eagle, observing events from impossible distances. She described it as feeling like Little Star was teaching her to use Apache ways of seeing that went beyond the physical world. They traveled hard for 3 days, moving only at night and resting during the heat of the day, in whatever shade they could find. The desert was unforgiving to travelers on foot, especially with children and elderly members slowing their pace. Water became a constant concern, with each precious drop carefully rationed among the 12 refugees. On the 3rd night, as they sheltered in a narrow arroyo beneath a sky brilliant with stars, Clarabelle approached Gray Fox with a request that chilled his blood. "I need to go back," she said quietly, settling beside him on his blanket. "To the wagon train. To find the truth about who I really am." Gray Fox looked at her sharply. Since leaving the canyon, Clarabelle had been growing stronger physically, but also more troubled emotionally. The memories of both her lives as Little Star and as Clarabelle were becoming clearer and more distinct, creating a constant internal conflict between her Apache spiritual awakening and her need to understand her white origins. "That would be madness," he said. "Those people cast you out to die. They believe you carry a curse." "But they also knew my parents," Clarabelle insisted. "Martha Donovan cared for me after my mother and father died. She might know things about my family, about why I'm different. Maybe my mother had contact with Apache people before I was born. Maybe there's a reason I carry Little Star's spirit." Bright Moon, who had been listening from her place by the small fire, made a sound of disagreement. "The white woman's knowledge will not explain the mystery of your dual souls, child. Some things cannot be understood through earthly investigation. But some things can," Clarabelle replied with a maturity that seemed far beyond her years. "I remember fragments of my white childhood now. My mother used to sing me songs in a language that wasn't English. She had scars on her arms that looked like rope burns. And sometimes, late at night, she would cry and speak names in Apache." This was the first time Clarabelle had mentioned specific memories from her life before the fever, and Gray Fox found himself intensely curious about these details. If her white mother had indeed had contact with Apache people, it might explain some aspects of Clarabelle's unusual condition, though it would still leave the question of how Little Star's spirit had found its way into her body. "The wagon train will be far ahead of us now," Swift Deer pointed out. "They move faster than we can on foot, and they have been traveling for days while we have been hiding." Clarabelle shook her head confidently. "They're not ahead of us. They're stuck." The wheel that Jonas Fletcher thought he had fixed properly broke again yesterday. They're camped at Dead Horse Spring, arguing about whether to continue with a damaged wagon or abandon it and redistribute the supplies. Gray Fox stared at her in amazement. Dead Horse Spring was more than 50 miles away, and there was no possible way she could know what was happening there through ordinary means, yet her previous predictions had all proven accurate. "How do you know this?" he asked. "I told you, spirit sight. When I close my eyes and let Little Star's memories guide me, I can see places and people from very far away. It's like flying, but invisible." Clarabelle's green eyes were serious as she met his gaze. "I know you don't want me to go back to them. I know you're afraid they'll try to hurt me again. But I have to know the truth about my white family. It's the only way I'll ever understand why the spirits chose me to carry both lives." The debate continued for hours, with Bright Moon arguing against any contact with the whites and Swift Deer, pointing out the tactical risks of approaching a wagon train that would undoubtedly be heavily armed. But Gray Fox found himself torn between his protective instincts and his recognition that Clarabelle's questions deserved answers. Finally, as dawn approached and the need for a decision became urgent, Clarabelle made a proposal that surprised everyone. "I'll go alone," she sighed. "They won't see me as a threat, just a sick child who miraculously survived in the desert. Martha Donovan will want to help me, and while she's caring for me, I can ask the questions I need to ask. You can watch from a distance, and if anything goes wrong, you can decide whether to intervene or let me handle it myself." "Absolutely not," Gray Fox said immediately. "I won't let you face those people alone. You won't be letting me do anything." Clarabelle replied with a flash of Little Star's old stubbornness. "I'm going whether you approve or not. The only question is whether you'll help me do it safely or force me to try it on my own." The argument that followed was intense but brief. In the end, it was Bright Moon who settled the matter with a pronouncement that carried the weight of spiritual authority. "The child speaks truth," the old medicine woman said. "She carries two souls, and both deserve to understand their origins. We cannot protect her from her destiny by hiding from it, but we can be wise in how we help her meet it." The plan they developed was complex but practical. Gray Fox and Swift Deer would scout the wagon train's location and defensive positions, while the rest of the band remained hidden in a series of caves 2 miles away. Clarabelle would approach the camp at midday, when the heat would make everyone drowsy and less alert. She would claim to have been wandering the desert alone since being separated from the group, delirious with fever and unable to remember clearly what had happened. "If they accept your story and welcome you back, you'll have time to ask your questions," Gray Fox explained as they prepared for the mission. "But if they react with suspicion or hostility, you must run immediately. Don't try to convince them or defend yourself. Just run toward the red rocks to the south and we'll be waiting." Clarabelle nodded solemnly, understanding the risks. "What if they try to restrain me? What if they think I'm still cursed?" "Then you use what Little Star taught you about being invisible," Bright Moon said, pressing a small leather pouch into Clarabelle's hands. "This is desert sage mixed with ground turquoise. If you scatter it in their fires, it will create a smoke that causes confusion and temporary blindness. It will give you time to escape." As the sun reached its zenith and the desert air shimmered with heat, Clarabelle walked alone across the open ground toward the wagon train camp. She had deliberately mussed her hair and dirtied her clothes to look like someone who had been surviving alone in the wilderness. The turquoise necklace was hidden beneath her shirt, and the pouch of sage mixture was tucked into her boot. From a concealed position among the rocks, Gray Fox watched through a spyglass taken from a cavalry patrol years earlier. He could see the sentries stationed around the camp's perimeter, and he counted the weapons visible among the wagons. 12 rifles, at least 4 pistols, and probably more hidden from view. If things went wrong, Clarabelle would be surrounded by hostile armed adults with no chance of fighting her way out. The first person to spot Clarabelle was a young boy tending the cattle herd. His shout of amazement brought adults running from all directions, and within moments, The entire camp was buzzing with excitement and confusion. Gray Fox could see Martha Donovan pushing through the crowd, her face a mixture of joy and disbelief as she reached the small figure walking steadily toward them, through the spyglass. Gray Fox watched Martha kneel and embrace Clarabelle, then immediately began examining her for injuries or signs of illness. Other women gathered around, offering water and food, while the men stood back discussing what Clarabelle's survival might mean for their own safety. If a child could survive alone in the desert, perhaps the dangers they feared were not as great as they had believed, but it was Ezra Caldwell's reaction that worried Gray Fox most. The wagon train leader stood apart from the group, welcoming Clarabelle, his arms crossed and his expression skeptical. Even from a distance, Gray Fox could see the suspicion in the man's posture, the way his eyes scanned the horizon as if looking for signs of a trap. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. Clarabelle was fed and given clean clothes, and she answered questions about her survival with a mixture of truth and carefully constructed lies. She had found water by following animal tracks to a hidden spring. She had eaten cactus fruit and roots she remembered from stories her mother had told her. She had hidden during the day and traveled at night to avoid the worst heat. The story was plausible enough to satisfy most of the adults, especially those who wanted to believe that abandoning her had not been tantamount to murder. But Gray Fox could see that Clarabelle was also asking questions of her own, drawing Martha Donovan aside for private conversations that seemed to grow more intense as the afternoon wore on. Then, just as Gray Fox was beginning to think the mission might succeed without incident, everything went wrong. Jonas Fletcher emerged from behind one of the wagons carrying something in his hands. A piece of torn cloth that Gray Fox recognized with a sinking heart as part of the blanket they had left with Clarabelle when they first found her. It was stained with desert sand and marked with symbols that Bright Moon had drawn on it during one of her healing ceremonies. Apache symbols that no child lost alone in the desert should have possessed. Fletcher's voice carried clearly across the camp as he confronted Clarabelle with his discovery. This was found near where we left you, girl. These markings ... they ain't natural. They're Apache medicine signs. How do you explain that? Gray Fox saw Clarabelle's small figure go very still, and he knew she was making rapid calculations about how to respond. Through the spyglass, he could see Caldwell moving closer, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. I don't know, Clarabelle said, her voice carrying just the right note of confusion and fear. I found that blanket caught on a bush. I thought it might have belonged to some traveler who passed through. But Fletcher wasn't satisfied. These symbols are fresh, girl. Drawn with sage and charcoal, just like the Apache use in their devil worship. Someone's been taking care of you, and it wasn't the desert. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Gray Fox could see the suspicion spreading through the crowd, the way hands moved instinctively toward weapons as the adults began to view Clarabelle not as a miraculous survivor, but as potential evidence of Apache presence in the area. Caldwell stepped forward, his authority reasserting itself as fear override compassion once again. Search her, he commanded. If she's been with Apaches, she might be carrying messages or weapons. Now wait just a minute, Martha Donovan protested, moving protectively in front of Clarabelle. She's just a child who's been through hell. You can't. I can and I will, Caldwell cut her off. That child has already brought us nothing but trouble, and if she's working with hostiles now, she's a threat to every soul in this train. Gray Fox tensed, his hand moving to his rifle. If they tried to search Clarabelle, they would find the turquoise necklace, an obviously Apache artifact that would confirm their worst suspicions. But as he prepared to signal Swift Deer for a rescue attempt, Clarabelle made a decision that surprised everyone. You want to know the truth? She said, her young voice cutting through the angry murmur of adult voices. The truth is that I am different. I always have been. My mother knew it. My father knew it. and now you know it too. But being different doesn't make me your enemy." She pulled the turquoise necklace from beneath her shirt, letting it catch the afternoon sunlight as it hung against her chest. "This belonged to someone I loved very much. Someone who died but taught me that love is stronger than death. And that family isn't defined by the color of your skin or the language you speak." The gasps and exclamations from the crowd were audible even at Gray Fox's distant position. Several people backed away from Clarabelle as if she had suddenly sprouted fangs, while others reached for weapons with the instinctive fear of confronting something they couldn't understand. But it was what Clarabelle did next that shocked Gray Fox to his core. Instead of running, instead of using Bright Moon's sage mixture to create confusion and escape, she began to speak in Apache, not to Gray Fox or to any hidden allies, but to the spirits of the desert itself. "Grandmother Sky," she called in the ancient language, her young voice carrying with otherworldly authority. "Father Wind, Mother Earth, show these people that your children come in many forms, but that your love embraces all who respect the sacred balance." As if in response to her words, the wind began to pick up, swirling dust devils around the wagon camp in patterns that looked almost like dancing figures. The horses grew restless, whinnying and pawing the ground as if sensing something their human companions could not perceive. And in the distance, a red-tailed hawk appeared, circling the camp 3 times, before letting out a cry that sounded almost like a human voice calling a warning. The effect on the wagon train was electric. Some of the adults fell to their knees in prayer, convinced they were witnessing either a miracle or demonic manifestation. Others backed away in terror, certain that Clarabelle was summoning Apache warriors to attack them. But a few, including Martha Donovan, stepped closer to the child with expressions of wonder rather than fear. "What are you?" Caldwell demanded, his pistol now drawn but held at his side rather than aimed at Clarabelle. Clarabelle's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. "I am what happens when 2 worlds collide and create something new. I am proof that the barriers we build between peoples exist only in our minds, not in the reality of what human souls can become." She turned to face Gray Fox's hiding place directly, though there was no way she should have been able to see him at that distance. When she spoke again, it was in English, but her words were clearly meant for him. "It's time," she said simply. "Time to stop hiding from what we all know is true. Time to find out if courage is stronger than fear." Gray Fox felt his heart stop as he realized what Clarabelle was doing. She was forcing a confrontation that could end in violence and death. But she was also creating an opportunity for truth that might never come again. The choice was his: remain hidden and safe, or step into the open and face whatever consequences might follow. In the wagon camp below, 43 pairs of eyes stared at the small girl with the Apache necklace and the otherworldly presence. Waiting to see what impossible thing would happen next, Gray Fox made his choice. Gray Fox emerged from the rocks like a specter materializing from the desert heat, his rifle held low but ready as he walked steadily toward the wagon camp. Every step across the open ground felt like a lifetime, with 43 pairs of eyes tracking his movement and the metallic clicks of weapons being cocked echoing across the stillness. He had faced cavalry charges and Mexican soldiers, but nothing had prepared him for the raw terror of walking unarmed into a circle of frightened settlers who saw him as the embodiment of every nightmare story they'd heard about Apache savages. Behind him, Swift Deer and the other warriors remained hidden among the rocks, under strict orders not to intervene unless Gray Fox signaled for help. This confrontation had to happen without violence if there was any hope of Clarabelle's impossible dream of peace between their peoples. One wrong move, one nervous trigger finger, and the desert would be painted with blood that could never be washed clean. Hold your fire, Martha Donovan shouted as several men raised their rifles, her voice cracking with desperation. He's not attacking, he's walking in peaceful. But Ezra Caldwell's pistol remained trained on Gray Fox's chest as the Apache warrior closed the distance to 30 yards, then 20, then finally stopped just beyond the circle of wagons. Up close, the wagon train members could see that he was exactly what they had expected and feared, a tall, powerful man with the weathered features of someone who had spent his life in warfare, his dark eyes holding secrets that spoke of violence and death. Yet there was something in his posture, something in the way he held himself, that suggested restraint rather than aggression. "I am Gray Fox of the Chiricahua Apache," he said in heavily accented but clear English, his voice carrying across the camp with quiet authority. "I come in peace to speak of the child you call Clara Bell." "That child is our concern, not yours," Caldwell replied, though his voice shook slightly as he spoke. "Whatever devil's bargain you made with her, we won't honor it." Gray Fox's eyes found Clara Bell standing in the center of the crowd, the turquoise necklace still gleaming against her chest. For a moment, their gazes locked, and he saw in her green eyes a mixture of fear and determination that reminded him so powerfully of Little Star that his breath caught in his throat. "There is no bargain," Gray Fox said, his attention returning to Caldwell. "Only truth that needs speaking. This child carries within her the spirit of my daughter, who died 7 winters ago. She speaks our language because she remembers being Apache. She knows our ways because they are written in her soul." The words sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the crowd. Several women crossed themselves, and Jonas Fletcher took a step backward as if distance could protect him from such impossible claims. "That's blasphemy," Caldwell snarled. "Souls don't jump from body to body like fleas on a dog. You've been filling that child's head with heathen nonsense." "Have I?" Gray Fox asked calmly. He reached into his belt and withdrew a piece of hide, covered with symbols drawn in charcoal and red clay. "This is a message my daughter drew for me 3 days before she died. She was 3 years old and could not read or write in any language. Yet she made these marks and told me they said, 'Father, I will come back to you when the sun and moon dance together.' I kept this hide because I thought it was the last thing she would ever give me." He held the hide up so everyone could see the symbols, then nodded toward Clara Bell. "Ask the child to read what it says. Ask her to tell you what those marks mean, though she has never seen them before." Clara Bell stepped forward, her small hands trembling as she studied the symbols on the hide. As she looked at them, her expression changed, becoming distant and focused in a way that made several adults step back nervously. "Father," she read, in a voice that seemed to echo with memory, "I will come back to you when the sun and moon dance together. When the white bird carries the red flower. When the spirit path opens between the worlds. Wait for me in the place where water sings to stones, and I will find you again." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Caldwell lowered his pistol slightly, his face pale with the implications of what they had just witnessed. There was no way a white child could have read Apache symbols she had never seen. No way she could have known the specific phrases that Gray Fox's daughter had used. "Impossible," Fletcher whispered. "She must have seen it before. You must have taught her." "When?" Gray Fox challenged. "I found this child dying in the desert 3 days ago. Before that, I had never seen her. Before that, she had been traveling with your wagon train for weeks. When would I have taught her anything?" Martha Donovan, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Clara Bell, where did you learn to speak Apache? Your parents never mentioned knowing any Indians." Clara Bell looked at Martha with eyes that seemed far older than her 7 years. "I remember learning it before I was born. In the place between lives where Little Star waited for a new body to carry her spirit. She taught me the language of her people so I would remember who I really was when the time came." "This is madness," Caldwell declared, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Even if what you're claiming is true, even if this child somehow carries an Apache soul, she's still white. She still belongs with her own kind. Does she?" Gray Fox asked quietly. Her own kind cast her out to die because they feared what they couldn't understand. My people took her in and healed her because we recognized the spirit within her. Which group truly accepts her for what she is? The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, challenging assumptions that ran deeper than conscious thought. Several of the wagon train members shifted uncomfortably, remembering their own role in abandoning Clara Belle to the desert. It was then that Clara Belle herself spoke, her young voice cutting through the tension with startling clarity. I remember my white mother now, she said, looking directly at Martha Donovan. She used to cry at night and speak Apache words when she thought I was sleeping. She had scars on her wrists from rope burns, and sometimes she would stare at the horizon like she was looking for someone who never came. Martha's face went white as Clara Belle continued. She told me stories about a brave warrior who saved her from bad men when she was younger. A warrior with eyes like midnight who taught her that love could exist between any two people, no matter what color their skin. She said my father was that warrior, but that he had to leave before I was born because it wasn't safe for any of us if he stayed. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. Gray Fox felt his knees nearly buckle as the pieces of an impossible puzzle began falling into place. Clara Belle wasn't just carrying Little Star's spirit. She was also his biological daughter. Born to a white woman he had loved and lost years before he ever met Little Star's Apache mother. That's not possible, he whispered. But even as he spoke the words, memories began flooding back. 7 years ago, before Little Star was born, he had encountered a wagon train under attack by Mexican bandits. He had helped fight off the raiders and had found among the survivors a young Irish woman named Catherine McKenna, who had been traveling to California to marry a man she had never met. Catherine had been injured in the attack, and Gray Fox had cared for her for 2 weeks while she recovered. During that time, they had fallen in love with an intensity that defied all logic and social convention. But both had known their love was impossible. She was white and promised to another man, while he was Apache and committed to protecting his people from the encroaching tide of white settlement. They had parted after those 2 weeks, both believing they would never see each other again. Gray Fox had returned to his band, and Catherine had continued west to her arranged marriage. He had never learned that their brief time together had created a child. Catherine McKenna, he said, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. Your mother was Catherine McKenna. Clara Belle nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She took her husband's name when she married, but she never forgot you. She named me Clara Belle because she said Belle meant beautiful and Clara meant bright, and you had told her that Apache daughters should have names that honored both their beauty and their wisdom. Gray Fox staggered backward, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning. Clara Belle was not just carrying Little Star's spirit, she was his actual daughter, born of a love he had thought was lost forever. The child who spoke Apache, because she carried an Apache soul, was also the child who had Apache blood flowing through her veins. This changes everything, Martha Donovan said quietly, her voice filled with wonder and sadness. If Clara Belle is truly your daughter... She's still white, Caldwell interrupted harshly, though his earlier certainty was beginning to crack. Apache father or not, she was born to a white woman and raised as a white child. She belongs with her own people. Which people? Clara Belle asked, her voice gaining strength as she finally understood her own identity. The white people who cast me out because I was different? Or the Apache people who welcomed me because they recognized the spirit I carry? I am both white and Apache, both Clara Belle and Little Star. I belong to both peoples and to neither. The philosophical implications of Clara Belle's dual nature were staggering, but the immediate practical concerns were even more pressing. Here was a child who represented everything both peoples feared about each other, living proof that the Boundaries between white and Apache were not as absolute as either side wanted to believe. "The child cannot remain with you," Caldwell declared, his authority reasserting itself as he struggled to maintain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his comprehension. Whatever her parentage, she was born into white society. She has legal rights and protections that we are bound to honor. Legal rights? Gray Fox laughed bitterly. You mean the legal right to be abandoned in the desert when she became inconvenient? The legal right to be called cursed and demon-possessed because she was different? Your white law offers her nothing but prejudice and fear. And your Apache law offers her what? Caldwell shot back. A life of constant warfare? Of running and hiding like animals? Of watching her people slowly destroyed by the inevitable march? Of civilization? The exchange was growing heated, and Gray Fox could sense that violence was only one harsh word away. But before he could respond, Clarabelle stepped between them, her small figure somehow commanding attention from all the armed adults around her. "Stop," she said simply, and something in her voice made every person in the camp fall silent. "You're arguing about which world I belong to, but you're both wrong. I don't belong to either world as they exist now. I belong to the world that could be the world where Apache and white people learn to live in peace, because they finally understand that their spirits are the same." She turned to face Gray Fox, her green eyes shining with tears and determination. "Father, I love you, and I remember being Little Star, but I also remember being Clarabelle, and I can't abandon that part of myself any more than I can abandon the Apache part." Then she turned to Martha Donovan and the other Wagon train members. "And I love Martha, who cared for me when my white mother died. I love the story she told me, and the song she sang, and the way she made me feel safe when I was scared. I can't abandon that part of myself either." Clarabelle reached up and unclasped the turquoise necklace, holding it in her small hands as she continued. "This necklace belonged to Little Star, but it also belongs to Clarabelle now. It represents both my lives, both my people's. And I want to use it to make a promise." She walked to the center of the space between Gray Fox and the wagon train, where the invisible line between two worlds seemed to shimmer in the desert heat. There she knelt and placed the necklace on the ground, her hands touching both the Apache turquoise and the white desert sand. "I promise that I will spend my life building bridges between our peoples," she said, her young voice carrying with supernatural clarity. "I will teach whites to understand Apache ways, and I will teach Apaches to understand white ways. I will be living proof that love is stronger than fear, and that family is defined by the heart, not by the color of skin." As she spoke, something extraordinary happened. The wind that had been whipping dust devils around the camp suddenly calmed to perfect stillness. The restless horses quieted, and even the distant cry of hawks fell silent. It was as if the desert itself was listening to the child's impossible promise. "But I can only build those bridges if both sides let me," Clarabelle continued, looking from Gray Fox to Caldwell and back again. "If you force me to choose between being Apache or white, then I choose neither. I'll walk into the desert alone and let the spirits decide my fate. But if you can find the courage to let me be both, then maybe together we can find a path to peace that doesn't require anyone to abandon who they are." The silence that followed stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Gray Fox found himself staring at this remarkable child who was his daughter in both blood and spirit. This bridge between worlds who was asking both peoples to take the most difficult step imaginable to trust in something they had never seen. Finally, it was Martha Donovan who broke the silence. "I don't understand all of this," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't understand how souls can move between bodies or how a white child can carry Apache memories. But I know that child has more wisdom in her 7 years than most adults accumulate in a lifetime. And I know that if we turn our backs on her again, we'll be turning our backs on hope itself." She walked forward and knelt beside Clarabelle, her weathered hands gently lifting the turquoise necklace and placing it back around the child's neck. "If you're willing to build bridges, then I'm willing to help you. Whatever that means, wherever it leads." Gray Fox felt his heart swell with an emotion he couldn't name as he watched this white woman accept his daughter, not despite her Apache nature, but because of her complete identity. He walked forward and knelt on Clarabelle's other side, his large hand covering both her small ones. "My daughter," he said in Apache, then repeated in English, "My daughter speaks wisdom that shamas us all. If she can find the courage to be both Apache and white in a world that tells her to choose, then perhaps we can find the courage to let her try." One by one, other members of the wagon train came forward, some reluctantly, some eagerly, but all of them somehow transformed by witnessing something they had thought impossible. Even Caldwell, though he kept his distance and his skepticism, made no move to stop what was happening. As the sun began to set and paint the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, a new kind of family began to form around Clarabelle family, bound not by blood or race, but by the shared recognition that love could indeed transcend any boundary human fear had constructed. But even as this miraculous reconciliation was taking place, none of them noticed the dust cloud on the eastern horizon that marked the approach of the cavalry patrol that had been hunting both the Apache band and the wagon train. The real test of Clarabelle's bridge between worlds was still to come. The cavalry patrol crested the ridge at sunset, 24 soldiers in dusty blue uniforms riding hard toward the wagon camp with the grim efficiency of men who had been tracking their quarry for days. At their head rode Captain Samuel Morrison, a career military officer whose weathered face bore the scars of 15 years, fighting Apache warriors across the Arizona territory. Behind him, his men sat their horses with the easy confidence of veterans who had survived countless skirmishes in some of the most unforgiving country on earth. Morrison raised his hand to halt the column while they were still half a mile from the wagon train, studying the scene below through his field glasses with the careful attention of a predator evaluating its prey. What he saw made him frown in confusion. Instead of the defensive circle he expected from settlers under threat, the wagons were arranged in a loose semicircle around what appeared to be some kind of gathering. People were sitting together around fires, sharing food and conversation, in a scene that looked more like a celebration than a siege. Sergeant Kelly, Morrison called to his second-in-command, a grizzled Irish veteran whose red beard was streaked with premature gray. "What do you make of this? Where are the Apache we've been tracking?" Kelly squinted through his own field glasses, scanning the camp for signs of the hostile presence they had been pursuing for 3 days. "Can't see any hostiles, sir, but that don't mean they ain't there. Could be hidden among the rocks, waiting to ambush us when we ride down." Morrison continued his study of the camp, noting details that didn't fit the pattern of Indian raids he had seen before. There were no signs of violence, no burned wagons or scattered supplies that would indicate an attack. The settlers appeared calm, even relaxed, gathering around their fires as evening approached. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of Morrison's neck stand up. In the center of the gathering, he could see a small figure that appeared to be a child, and around that child were grouped both white settlers, and Morrison's blood ran cold. What were unmistakably Apache warriors. "Jesus and Mary," Kelly breathed, having spotted the same impossible sight. "Sir, are those savages sitting down to dinner with them settlers?" Morrison lowered his field glasses, his mind racing through tactical possibilities and political implications. In 15 years of frontier warfare, he had never encountered anything like this. Apache and white settlers simply did not share meals and conversation. They fought, they killed, they died, but they did not break bread together like old friends. "There's something very wrong here," Morrison said finally. "Either those settlers are being held hostage and putting on a show for our benefit, or..." He paused, unable to voice the alternative that was even more disturbing to contemplate. Or what, sir? Or we're looking at something that's going to turn every assumption we have about this war upside down. Morrison's voice was grim as he contemplated the implications. If white settlers and Apache could indeed coexist peacefully, it would undermine the entire military strategy that had justified his career and the careers of thousands of other soldiers. Orders, sir? Kelly asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the peaceful scene below and weighing his options. Protocol demanded that he ride down with weapons ready, assume the settlers were under duress, and eliminate any Apache presence with maximum force. But something about the scene nagged at him, some quality of genuine interaction that couldn't be faked under threat of violence. We go down peaceful, he decided finally. Weapons ready but not aimed. If this is some kind of trap, we'll deal with it. But if it's what it appears to be... He shook his head, still unable to fully process the possibility. If it's what it appears to be, then we need to understand it before we destroy it. In the wagon camp below, Clara Bell was the first to spot the approaching cavalry. Her spirit sight had been warning her of their presence for hours, but she had hoped they might pass by without investigating the smoke from the evening fires. Now, as the line of blue-coated soldiers began their descent toward the camp, she knew the most dangerous test of her bridge between worlds was about to begin. "Soldiers coming," she announced quietly, her words cutting through the relaxed conversation around the fires. 24 men with a captain who's seen too much war. They're not sure what they're looking at, but they're ready to shoot first and ask questions later. Gray Fox was on his feet instantly, his hand moving instinctively toward his rifle before he caught himself. The other Apache warriors followed suit, their bodies tensing for combat even as their minds processed the impossible situation they found themselves in. They were surrounded by white settlers with nowhere to run and no tactical advantage if fighting broke out. "No," Clara Bell said firmly, moving to place herself between Gray Fox and the approaching soldiers. "This is exactly what I was talking about. The moment soldiers appear, everyone assumes we have to choose sides. But what if we don't? What if we show them that Apache and white can stand together instead of falling back into old patterns of fear?" "Child, you don't understand," Ezra Caldwell said, his own hands shaking as he reached for his rifle. "Those soldiers see Apache warriors in our camp. They're going to assume we're hostages. They'll start shooting to rescue us, and everyone will die in the crossfire. Then we have to make sure they understand the truth before they start shooting," Clara Bell replied with a calmness that seemed impossible for someone her age. "Martha, you know how to talk to soldiers. Gray Fox, you know how to show strength without threatening violence. Together, you can make them listen." Gray Fox looked at the approaching cavalry column, calculating distances and firepower with the automatic reflex of a warrior who had survived 15 years of such encounters. "There are too many of them," he said quietly. "Even if we wanted to fight, we couldn't win. Swift Deer and the others are still hidden in the rocks, but they can't help us without revealing their position." "We're not going to fight," Clara Bell said with absolute conviction. "We're going to do something that's never been tried before. We're going to tell them the truth and trust that somewhere underneath all their training and prejudice they're still human beings capable of recognizing something beautiful when they see it." The next few minutes passed with agonizing slowness as the cavalry patrol approached the camp at a measured pace, neither charging aggressively nor retreating to a safe distance. Captain Morrison rode at the front of the column, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of threat or deception, while his men remained in formation behind him, ready to respond to whatever orders he might give when they were 50 yards from the camp. Morrison raised his hand again, and the column halted. In the silence that followed, the only sounds were the snorting of horses and the soft crackling of cooking fires. "This is Captain Samuel Morrison, United States Cavalry," Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "We've been tracking Apache hostiles in this area. Are you people safe? Do you require assistance?" Martha Donovan stepped forward, positioning herself where Morrison could clearly see her, while Clara Bell moved to stand beside her, the turquoise necklace gleaming visibly against her chest. Gray Fox remained slightly behind them, his posture upright and proud but not threatening. "We are safe, Captain," Martha called back. "And we do not require assistance in the way you mean. But we may have something to offer you that's more valuable than any rescue." Morrison's eyebrows rose at the unexpected response. In his experience, settlers encountering cavalry patrols either begged for protection or reported Indian attacks. They did not offer mysterious assistance to the soldiers sent to protect them. "Explain yourself, man," Morrison replied, urging his horse a few steps closer, but keeping his men at a distance that would allow for rapid tactical response if needed. "My name is Martha Donovan," she said clearly. "This is Clara Bell, and this is her father, Gray Fox of the Chiricahua Apache. What you're seeing here isn't a hostage situation or an uneasy truce. It's the beginning of something new, proof that white and Apache people can live in peace when they choose understanding over fear." The words hit Morrison like a physical blow. He had been prepared for many possibilities, but not for a calm declaration that everything he believed about the Apache War was wrong. His eyes moved from Martha to Clara Bell, noting the child's obviously mixed heritage, then to Gray Fox, whose dignity and restraint seemed at odds with every story he had heard about Apache savagery. "Ma'am," Morrison said carefully, "I think you may be confused about the nature of the men you're dealing with. Apache warriors don't make peace. They raid, they kill, and they disappear back into the mountains. This man you're calling a father is likely holding you under threat." "No threat but the threat of understanding," Gray Fox said, speaking for the first time in English that was heavily accented but clear. "Your soldiers have hunted my people for many years, Captain. You know us only as enemies to be destroyed. But this child, my daughter, she shows us another way is possible." Morrison's military training screamed at him to order an immediate attack. Apache warriors did not engage in philosophical discussions with cavalry officers. They fought or they fled, but they never stood in open ground offering to explain themselves. Yet something about Gray Fox's bearing, something about the calm confidence in his voice, made Morrison hesitate. "Your daughter?" Morrison asked, looking more closely at Clara Bell. The child's mixed heritage was obvious now that he was looking for it. The auburn hair and green eyes of Celtic ancestry, combined with the bone structure and bearing that spoke of Apache blood. Clara Bell stepped forward, her young voice carrying with surprising authority. "Captain Morrison, you've spent your career fighting a war that doesn't have to exist. My father's people and my mother's people have been killing each other because they believe they have nothing in common. But I am living proof that they're wrong." She gestured toward the mixed group gathered around the fires, Apache warriors sitting beside white settlers, sharing food and stories despite their different languages and customs. "Look around you, Captain. Really look. Do you see enemies forced together by violence? Or do you see human beings choosing to know each other instead of fear each other?" Morrison did look, and what he saw challenged every assumption he had built his career upon. The Apache warriors were relaxed but alert, their weapons within reach but not in their hands. The white settlers showed no signs of distress or coercion, and several of them were actually engaged in animated conversations with the Apache, using hand gestures and broken phrases to bridge the language barrier. "This is impossible," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Apache don't make peace with whites. It goes against everything they believe." "Does it?" Clara Bell asked. "Or does it go against everything you've been told they believe? When did you last try to talk to an Apache warrior instead of shooting at him? When did you last ask what they really want instead of assuming you already knew?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, challenging Morrison to examine beliefs he had never questioned. In 15 years of frontier warfare, he realized with growing discomfort, he had never actually had a conversation with an Apache warrior. He had fought them, chased them, killed them, but he had never once tried to understand them. "What do you want?" he asked Gray Fox directly, the question feeling strange on his tongue. Gray Fox was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of pain and loss. "I want my people to live without fear of your soldiers. I want my daughter to grow up in a world where she doesn't have to choose between her Apache spirit and her white blood. I want peace, Captain Morrison, but not the peace of surrender, the peace of understanding." "And what would such a peace look like?" Morrison asked, surprised to find himself genuinely curious about the answer. It was Clara Bell who replied, her young voice filled with a vision that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her 7 years. "It would look like Apache warriors teaching white settlers how to find water in the desert and survive in this harsh land. It would look like white settlers sharing their knowledge of farming and building with Apache families who want to make permanent homes. It would look like children like me growing up speaking both languages and carrying both traditions, proving that you can honor your ancestors without hating your neighbors." The image Clara Bell painted was so far removed from the reality of frontier warfare that Morrison felt dizzy contemplating it. But as he looked around the camp again, seeing Apache and white people sharing meals and conversation, he began to wonder if the impossible might actually be possible. "Even if what you're suggesting could work," Morrison said slowly, "it would require approval from territorial authorities, from Washington itself. Soldiers like me don't make policy, Miss Clara Bell. We just follow orders." "Then maybe it's time for the order followers to start giving the order makers some new information," Clara Bell replied with a wisdom that seemed ancient despite her young years. "Maybe it's time for someone to tell Washington that there's another way to end this war besides killing everyone who looks different." Sergeant Kelly, who had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement, finally spoke up. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" Morrison nodded, grateful for the interruption that allowed him time to process what he was hearing. "Sir, I've been fighting Apache for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this. These people aren't acting like hostages, and that warrior ain't acting like a raider. If there's even a chance that what this child is saying is true." Kelly paused, struggling with concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. "If there's a chance it's true, then what, Sergeant?" "Then maybe we owe it to all the good men we've lost to at least try to understand it before we destroy it," Kelly finished quietly. Morrison sat his horse in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on him like the desert heat. He could order his men to arrest the Apache warriors and continue the endless cycle of violence that had defined his career. Or he could take the unprecedented step of listening to a 7-year-old girl who claimed she could bridge two worlds finally. He dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward the group around the fires, his hand conspicuously away from his weapon. "Miss Clara Bell," he said formally, "I'd like to hear more about this piece you're proposing." "And Gray Fox," he continued, looking directly at the Apache warrior, "I'd like to understand what it would take for your people to trust mine enough to try it." As Captain Morrison settled beside the fire that brought together Apache and white for the first time in territorial history, Clara Bell smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just proven that courage was indeed stronger than fear, and that even the most impossible dreams could take root in the most unlikely soil. But the real test would come when Morrison had to decide whether to report this encounter as a successful elimination of Apache threats, or as the beginning of something so unprecedented that it might change the course of the entire frontier war. 3 months later, the settlement that would eventually be known as Harmony Valley had grown from a single wagon camp into something unprecedented in the Arizona Territory. Adobe buildings stood alongside traditional Apache wickiups, while children with faces reflecting every shade from pale Irish to deep Apache brown played together in the dusty streets, their laughter carrying on the desert wind like a promise of better days to come. Clarabelle stood on the porch of the schoolhouse she had helped design, watching as her two worlds continued their slow, careful dance of integration. The building itself embodied her vision, constructed with Apache knowledge of desert building techniques but incorporating the formal classroom structure that white settlers expected for their children's education. Inside, lessons were taught in both English and Apache, with children learning the practical skills of desert survival alongside reading, writing, and arithmetic. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. Word of the impossible peace at Harmony Valley had spread across the territory like wildfire, bringing curious visitors, hostile critics, and government officials who struggled to categorize what they were witnessing. Some came with weapons, expecting to find evidence of deception or coercion. Others came with legal documents, trying to assert various forms of authority over the unprecedented community. But most came with wonder, drawn by stories of a place where the endless cycle of raid and retaliation had been broken by a 7-year-old girl who spoke with the wisdom of ages and carried within her the living proof that love could indeed transcend any boundary human fear had constructed. Captain Morrison had become an unexpected ally in protecting the growing settlement. His initial report to territorial headquarters had been carefully worded to emphasize the strategic value of having peaceful Apache allies rather than the more revolutionary implications of what was actually happening at Harmony Valley. As weeks passed and no attacks emerged from the settlement, Morrison found himself defending the community against military colleagues who viewed any peace with Apache as a sign of weakness. "It's working, Clarabelle," Morrison said as he joined her on the schoolhouse porch, his blue uniform now dusty from helping repair the settlement's water storage system. "The territorial governor is sending an official delegation next month to observe what we've built here. If they're impressed, we might get formal recognition as an official peace treaty." Clarabelle nodded thoughtfully, but her expression remained troubled. At 10 years old now, she had grown taller and stronger, but the weight of being a bridge between worlds had aged her beyond her years. The turquoise necklace still hung around her neck, but it was now accompanied by a small silver cross that Martha Donovan had given her, a symbol of her determination to honor both sides of her heritage. "Recognition would be good," she said carefully, "but I'm worried about what happens when the story spreads beyond the territory. There are people in Washington who won't want to believe that peace is possible. They've built too much power on the idea that Apache and white can never coexist." Morrison's expression darkened. Clarabelle had developed an unsettling ability to see the political implications of their success more clearly than adults who had spent years in government service. She understood that Harmony Valley represented more than just a local peace treaty. It was living proof that the entire basis for westward expansion and Indian policy might be fundamentally wrong. "Then we make sure we're too valuable to destroy," Morrison replied. "The settlement is producing more food per acre than any farm in the territory because we're using Apache water management techniques. Our children are the healthiest in Arizona because they're learning traditional Apache medicine alongside modern medical practices. And we haven't lost a single person to Indian raids because we are the Indians, working together instead of against each other." Clarabelle smiled at Morrison's fierce protectiveness of the community he had initially come to destroy. The career soldier had become one of Harmony Valley's most passionate advocates, writing detailed reports about the practical benefits of Apache-white cooperation and quietly building alliances with other military officers who were tired of the endless, costly frontier warfare. "Gray Fox wants to expand the settlement," Clarabelle said, changing the subject to the challenge that kept her awake at night. "His cousin's band is being hunted by Colonel Patterson's regiment. 30 Apache, including women and children, who have nowhere else to go. If we take them in, we'll triple our size overnight." Morrison frowned. Patterson was known for his brutal efficiency in hunting Apache bands, and he viewed any form of peace negotiation as treason to the white race. If Patterson's quarry found refuge at Harmony Valley, it would force a confrontation that could destroy everything they had built. "Can we defend them?" Morrison asked. "We shouldn't have to," Clara Bell replied with the idealism that still burned bright despite 3 months of harsh political realities. "This is supposed to be a place where Apache don't need defending because they're not seen as enemies. Should and reality are two different things, child. If Patterson comes here looking for those Apache, he won't be interested in our philosophy of peace." Clara Bell was quiet for a long moment, watching the mixed community going about its daily business below them. Apache women teaching white children how to weave baskets. White men learning from Apache elders how to track game and read weather. Signs, her own father, Gray Fox, working alongside Ezra Caldwell to plan the expansion of the settlement's irrigation system. "Then maybe it's time to stop hiding what we've accomplished," she said finally. "Maybe it's time to invite the whole world to see what's possible when people choose love over fear." The delegation that arrived 2 weeks later was unlike anything Harmony Valley had ever seen. Territorial Governor William Thompson came with an entourage that included newspaper reporters from as far away as San Francisco, government officials from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and even a photographer whose massive camera equipment required its own wagon. But most significantly, he came with Colonel Patterson and a full company of cavalry, ostensibly for protection, but clearly as a show of federal authority. Clara Bell stood with Gray Fox and Martha Donovan to greet the delegation, wearing a dress that Martha had sewn for the occasion but decorated with Apache beadwork that Bright Moon had added. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had learned to represent an entire vision of possibility, even as her heart raced with the knowledge that everything she had worked for could be destroyed by the decisions made in the next few hours. Governor Thompson was a portly man with calculating eyes who had built his political career on promises to protect white settlers from Apache raids. His initial tour of Harmony Valley was conducted with the skeptical air of someone looking for evidence of deception, but as the hours passed, his expression gradually shifted from suspicion to amazement. The settlement worked, not just as a temporary truce or uneasy coexistence, but as a thriving community that had solved problems that had plagued the territory for decades. Apache knowledge of desert agriculture had increased crop yields by 300%. The integration of traditional Apache healing practices with modern medicine had virtually eliminated the childhood diseases that killed settlers' children every summer. And the presence of Apache scouts had made the settlement the most secure location in the territory, protected by a network of intelligence that no military force could match. "This is remarkable," Governor Thompson admitted to Clara Bell as they stood in the center of the settlement's main square. "I came here expecting to find a dangerous delusion. Instead, I find a functioning community that outperforms every white settlement in the territory." "It's what happens when people work together instead of against each other," Clara Bell replied. "Simply, when you combine Apache knowledge of this land with white knowledge of agriculture and building, both peoples become stronger than they could ever be alone." But it was Colonel Patterson's reaction that would determine Harmony Valley's ultimate fate. The military officer had remained silent throughout the tour, his weathered face showing no emotion as he observed the impossible reality of Apache and white cooperation. When Governor Thompson asked for his military assessment, Patterson's response would either legitimize the settlement or condemn it. "Sir," Patterson said finally, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years of frontier warfare, "in 3 decades of fighting Apache, I have never seen them live peacefully with whites. I have seen them raid. I have seen them kill, and I have seen them die. but I have never seen them build schools and share meals and teach their children to play together." Patterson paused, looking directly at Clarabelle with eyes that had seen too much death and destruction. "This child has accomplished something that all our bullets and cavalry charges could never achieve. She has ended the war. Not by defeating the Apache, but by proving that the war was never necessary in the first place." The colonel's words rang across the settlement like a bell, marking the moment when Harmony Valley transformed from a local curiosity into a model for an entirely different approach to the challenges of the American frontier. Within months, the news would spread across the continent and eventually across the world. The story of a 7-year-old girl who had been cast out to die because she was different, and who had returned to prove that difference could be a bridge instead of a barrier. Clarabelle smiled as she watched the delegation prepare for their journey back to the territorial capital, knowing that they carried with them more than just reports and photographs. They carried proof that the impossible was possible, that love was indeed stronger than fear, and that a child who belonged to two worlds could teach both worlds how to belong to each other. As the sun set over Harmony Valley, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clarabelle felt the spirit of Little Star stirring within her, not as a separate presence, but as part of her complete self. She was Apache and White, Little Star and Clarabelle, a bridge between worlds who had fulfilled her promise to build something beautiful from the ashes of ancient hatred. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled the settlement 3 times before, disappearing into the vast Arizona sky, carrying with it the message that some endings are really beginnings, and that the most impossible dreams sometimes take root in the most unlikely places.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.